Throughout the 1700s, the European powers regularly fought with each other. The expansion of European control around the globe and the colonial conflicts that resulted added to the tensions between the European powers. These colonial conflicts were a major factor in one of the biggest wars of the century, the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War. George Washington, the future first president of the United States, played a role in sparking this war, which would ultimately lead to fighting around the world in what would become the First Global War. The conflict's origins were over territorial disputes between the British and French colonies of North America. The French had established themselves in Canada around the Great Lakes and along the Mississippi River, while the British colonies were primarily along the Atlantic coast. This left a significant portion of territory in between them that was not occupied by either power. Both countries made claims on this territory, which eventually led them into direct conflict. In the early 1750s, the British colonies and the government of New France made moves to take control of this land, in particular the region of the Ohio River. The colony of Virginia made grants of land in Ohio to settlers, while the government of New France decreed that all British merchants and traders must leave the territory. The French even began destroying key British trading posts and hunting down and removing British merchants. In 1754, George Washington was dispatched by the colony of Virginia to the Ohio region in order to defend British interests there against the French. The British were working on the construction of a fort in the region that would have helped them establish control of the territory. Before construction was finished, a large force of French soldiers, over 500 men, arrived and took control of the fort. Washington received news of this as he was marching north to provide support. His force of around 160 men was much smaller, but he hoped to be reinforced by additional troops from Virginia, as well as from some of the other colonies. In the meantime, though, he had the support of some local native allies. Washington continued marching north until reports came to him indicating that a detachment of the main French force was approaching. He decided to hold his position and build defenses in response. Tensions were high over the next few days as Washington and his men struggled to locate the approaching French troops. There were reports of ominous noises in the forest at night, and some of his soldiers opened fire at these noises. Washington came to suspect that the French were spying on them, and that the approaching French detachment was intent on attacking. He then decided to go on the offensive. They began scouting for the French party, and eventually his native allies discovered where they were encamped. On the morning of May 28th, they approached the French encampment, and a skirmish broke out. The details of what exactly happened are uncertain. Washington claimed that the French opened fire first, while other accounts tell a different story. Either way, the French were caught by surprise and were readily defeated. At one point, one of the French soldiers, named Jumonville, tried to stop the fighting. He claimed that he was a diplomat sent to deliver a message to the British. Apparently, as he was relaying this message, which was that the British must leave the area, he was murdered. According to some accounts of the incident, the Indian chief known as Half-King killed Jumonville, while several of his men engaged in a massacre of some of the remaining French troops. Another version was that a musket was fired by the British, which killed Jumonville, and that the natives rushed to stop the British from killing the French. Of the 35 men in the French detachment, around 10 were killed, while most of the rest were captured. The fact that Jumonville was claimed by the French to be a diplomat undercut Washington's claim that the French detachment was sent to attack them. This had the potential to put a negative light on Washington's actions, making him appear overly aggressive. Later on, this would become an important issue. Following the skirmish, Washington further built up his defensive positions, establishing what he called Fort Necessity. He was reinforced by additional colonial troops, but his forces were still significantly smaller than the French force which had been sent toward them in retaliation for the earlier skirmish. The French arrived on July 3rd and began a day-long assault on Fort Necessity. They had a significant advantage as they were able to take cover behind trees and rocks, while the British forces were hemmed in and largely out in the open. The British sustained heavy casualties. Around 100 men, or a third of Washington's forces, were killed or wounded. The French, meanwhile, only had 3 killed and 17 wounded. It also began raining later in the day, which made it impossible for the British to keep their weapons dry and maintain their fire. In the evening, the French finally signaled that they were willing to discuss terms for surrender. Washington agreed to surrender and signed a surrender agreement late in the evening. The agreement was generous in that it allowed Washington and his men to return home. Unfortunately, Washington, in the surrender agreement, inadvertently confessed to the assassination of Jumonville. There was likely some miscommunication around the word that was used to describe Jumonville's death, and Washington didn't realize the level of guilt that the wording placed on him. The French used this confession as a point of propaganda, and it served as an embarrassment for Washington when he returned to Virginia. The French were able to characterize the British as the aggressors, and Washington as a rogue killer. Despite this, they sought to portray their actions not as part of a war, but as a reprisal for the killing of Jumonville. War, though, would come anyways. Washington was at the center of this first open battle of what would become a major global war. It's important, however, to not overstate his role, as tensions between Britain and France and among the other European powers were boiling over, and war was likely inevitable. Washington's decision, though, to ambush the French detachment that morning did serve as a spark for the coming war. While initially being resistant to getting involved in this colonial conflict, the British King George II eventually agreed to commit additional troops to America. He sent General Edward Braddock to Ohio to expel the French there, and a fleet to the Gulf of St. Lawrence to establish a blockade and prevent reinforcements from arriving from France. These actions took place in 1755, a year before war officially broke out between France and Britain and between the other European states. The other major cause for the war was the growing power of the state of Prussia. As the major countries of Europe saw that France and Britain were moving towards open war, they maneuvered and switched alliances, hoping to gain an advantage that would allow them to achieve their strategic goals. Both Austria and Russia had concerns about an expanding Prussia, and were seeking support for a war against Prussia. As a counter to this, Prussia entered into a defensive alliance with Britain. For Britain, this was essential, as Britain had sought to avoid open war with France until it had an ally in mainland Europe with an army that could help defend its continental territory. This development pushed France away from its alliance with Prussia into an alliance with Austria and Russia. Finally, in 1756, in response to Austria and Russia massing troops on their borders, King Frederick II of Prussia marched against Austria, beginning the war in Europe. The war began with Britain, Prussia, and Hanover on one side, and France, Russia, Austria, and Saxony on the other. Later, Spain, Portugal, and Sweden would also become involved. Throughout the war, there was heavy fighting in North America. Britain and France fought for control of territory and key strategic locations. Fighting spread to India as well, as both Britain and France had colonies there. There was also fighting in South America, where Spain attacked Portuguese Brazil, and in Africa, where Britain captured several French outposts. The war took on a global scale as a result of European colonial expansion. After several years of the war mostly favoring France and its allies, the tide began to turn. Significant victories were won in 1759 and 1760, and in 1762, Russia exited the conflict. Finally, the war came to an end in 1763. In the peace treaty, France was forced to cede most of its colonial possessions in North America to Britain. This paved the way for a major expansion of settlement by British colonists, while the war also put Britain heavily in debt, creating a need for expanded taxation. These would both become major factors in the build-up to the American Revolution a few years later.